everybody for being here, virtually at least. And thank you, of course, Silvia and João, for giving me this opportunity to put together some ideas about the relation between biology and computation. This is a kind of first attempt to put these very different ideas on which I have been thinking during the last months. So just give me one moment, because I have always some problem with all the icons of. Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, not in full screen.
Yeah, just one moment. Okay.
Redimension.
Yep, but because okay. Now.
Okay.
Okay. Well, so as you probably know, and if you don't know, it is not a problem, because we are going to talk about that today. Computational techniques and methods are ubiquitous in biology. Well, one may object that this situation is common to many other contemporary scientific fields. Still, the relation between biology and computation is somehow tighter than the relation between computation and other sciences, with the possible exception of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, it is not just the case that virtually all biological systems and processes, genetic, developmental, evolutionary, ecological, etc., can be understood, analyzed, and simulated through computationally, but also the other way around. Computational techniques are frequently inspired in biological knowledge. This is the case, for instance, of genetic algorithms, evolutionary computation, etc. And far from being working tools just for computer scientists, many biological inspired algorithms have been employed in their turn to model or understand biological phenomena. Again, from genetics, evolutionary biology, ecology, etc. And finally, and perhaps most notably, computation in biology is not only conceived as a means to predict the behavior of a system. Biological systems themselves are often interpreted as capable of performing computation in their own right. So in this latter sense, computation provides a fundamental tool for theoretical projects aimed to reproduce and control living processes, living and evolutionary processes, like happens like in artificial life or scientific biology. So the goals of today, sorry, because I cannot see the pointer of my mouse, so I cannot. Let me. Okay, so the goals of my today talk is to provide a criteria for a taxonomy of different possible approaches to computation in biology, to plug into this taxonomy some amongst the most important research programs in contemporary biology, and finally, to sketch a list of open conceptual problems arising from this taxonomy. Needless to say, this is a work in progress. This is a very programmatic work, exploratory. So you have to take into account that we will find in this talk a lot of questions, but just a few answers. And the interesting part will be probably the final discussion. Well, so to start with these two distinctions that on which I aim to ground my taxonomy. These are two distinctions between two different possible approaches to computation in science, more in general, not just in biology. The first distinction is between computational modeling and computational explanation. I draw this distinction from Piccinini 2015, and he said that in computational modeling, the outputs of a computing system C are used to describe some behavior of another system S under some conditions. And on the other hand, in computational explanations, some behavior of a system S is explained by a particular kind of process internal to S, computation, and by the properties of that computation. So, for instance, we find computational modeling virtually in any area of contemporary science. We have here some example from physics, biology, and economics. We use computational models to understand the formation and development of stars and galaxies. In biology, to understand and explain a lot of different phenomena. Here, the example is the evolution of life. And in economics and social science, to understand, for instance, the progression of an economy and the consequences of decision procedures in an organization. But these are just a few examples. So the main characteristics of computational models is that this is well known. They are used to overcome the difficulty of solving analytically the equations representing the behavior of complex phenomena. They are usually not intended to depict the causes or the mechanisms responsible for the behavior of the system under study. So they provide a high-level description of the system being studied. And they pursue predictive goals or aim to test hypotheses concerning the overall structure and or dynamics of the systems, or the system under study. On the other hand, we find that we have here some examples of computational explanations, for instance, in cognitive science, McCulloch's and Pitt's models of neuron, or in biology, the analysis of bacterial chemotaxis, or for instance, in digital physics, these models by Wolfram 2001 of very basic phenomenal physical processes in terms of cellular automata dynamics. The main characteristics of these computational explanations is that they aim to provide a low-level or back-end description of natural phenomena. And they assume that a computational simulation or an alternative artificial realization of the phenomenon under study captures some of their constitutive, causal, functional, or structural properties. Okay. So then we can pass on to the second distinction, that is between mathematical and engineering approaches to computation in science. Computer sciences is a label that includes a lot of different approaches to computation, a lot of different theories. Among them, we find a theory of complexity, a theory of computation, a theory of automata, a theory of data structures and algorithms, a theory of computer architecture and organization, software engineering, and so on. So we can find in science some research programs that interact with computer sciences, because computer sciences provide to these sciences tools for data mining, analysis, and manipulation, or techniques of implementation of statistical models and simulations, or algorithmic techniques of problem solving and optimization, or even formal frameworks to think about the evolution of a system. Okay, and research programs focused on what we may call the mathematical virtues of computation are, for instance, computational models of cognition, optimality models in social sciences and evolutionary biology, and various applications of genetic algorithms to many different areas of science. On the other hand, we find some research programs in science that interact with computer sciences because these computational theories provide, because computation sciences provide a theory of computer design and circuitry, procedures for information coding, and a conceptual foundation for robotics. So We have two distinctions that are very broad and they are partly overlapping. I mean, they are intended to identify very big areas of research that are the first one, distinction between computational modeling and computational explanation, and on the other hand, the distinction between mathematical approaches to computation in science and engineering approaches to computation in science. So if we put these distinctions on the extreme of two axes, we can obtain this four quadrants graph in which we can define four different approaches to computation in biology. Okay, so starting from mathematical modeling and proceeding counterclockwise, we find mathematical explanations, engineering explanations, and engineering modeling. So I now proceed to describe all these broad theoretical projects in some detail. Well, when I talk of mathematical modeling, I intend a very heterogeneous group of theoretical enterprises in biology. Most of them fall under that category that is called, theoretical project is called bioinformatics and include practices like genome mapping, sequencing, and comparison, but also some parts of system biology, like for instance, the reconstruction of methodological networks, and of evolutionary biology, for instance, the reconstruction of molecular evolution of certain species or taxa. The definitory characteristics of this approach to computation in biology, the mathematical modeling, is that they include data mining, classification, and retrievals of an analysis of data. Computation is used to provide solution of biostatistical problems that require sophisticated techniques of optimization. And the most common computational methods used to solve this kind of problems are dynamic programming, Monte Carlo simulations, bounded search tree, genetic algorithms, etc. I would include within mathematical modeling also the simulation of developmental and evolutionary dynamics. And I will characterize this broad category, the goal of this broad category of mathematical modeling as the generation of generalization shared properties of genome expression, metabolic pathways, and molecular evolution. We can now pass on to our second category, which is mathematical explanation. I think that the most representative example of mathematical explanation in biology is provided by what is called soft artificial life. That is a creation of software in which strings of code struggle in order to replicate or reproduce more. Two very well-known example of software of this kind are Race, Tierra, and Avida. Those scientists that aim to provide mathematical explanations of biological systems or processes think that a computational simulated biological system share properties like reproduction, growth, evolution, metabolism with biological systems themselves. And in this sense, this kind of models like Race, Tierra, or Avida cease to become models of life and becomes examples of life itself. So starting on the presupposition that biological properties are somehow multiply realizable, according to those authors, we are allowed to say that they are fundamentally informational or computational. And in this sense, since they are identified by purely abstract characteristics, we could say that life and evolution are intrinsically virtual processes to be studied regardless of their specific contingent physical implementation. Our third category is engineering explanations. We find within this category many different theoretical projects in synthetic biology, system biology, or what is called hard artificial life. We have here some picture representing application of this approach to biological circuit design or cellular signaling or the study of network motifs. Within this category, we find the idea that biological processes, mainly biochemical and developmental processes, are multiply realizable, but differently from purely mathematical explanations. In order to represent or reproduce them, we must focus on their mechanical details, not just on an abstract or mathematical representations. So biological systems are explained in terms of biological components which are believed to be functionally analogous to logical gates, clocks, adders, or other components that are crucial in the construction of a computer. So differently from mathematical explanations, which focus on abstract mathematical descriptions, the emphasis here is on concepts like organization, design, or architectural constraints. Finally, we find a last category, which is engineering modeling. We find in this category some other theoretical projects that are usually labeled in synthetic biology. I mean, synthetic biology, of course, it is a very broad category. It is not a theory in itself. It includes many different practices, models, and theories. So we find some theories or practices that are more easily plugged within the category of engineering explanation, while others works better if we understand them as example of engineering modeling. And we can also plug in this category studies in biorobotics. In these two figures, we find, for instance, here a picture of Fisarum machines, which are interesting because they are an example of slime mold computation. Slime mold has been employed in the last 10 years to compute many different phenomena like the shortest path between 2 points, or simulate road networks and mass migration, or even to solve problems related to computational geometry and or graph optimization. And in the other picture, we have a picture depicting a biorobot. The biobot, the name biobot identify some different things. In some cases, we call biobot an organism that is artificially modified through an engineeristic device which allow to computationally manipulate it. In other cases, we call biobots some modified organism which is programmed at the computer. But besides the differences between these different kinds and sense of biobots, all this engineering modeling can be characterized by the fact that they involve the manipulation or reconstruction of natural or hybrid artifacts in order to improve biological biological processes, or they involve the use of unconventional supports for computations. And this is modeling, at least in two senses. In one sense, because artificial systems are used as model organisms to test practical knowledge in biorobotics, and this is indeed the case of biorobotics, or artificial systems are used to model other non-necessarily phenomena. And this is the case, for instance, of slime mold computation. Okay, so we have put the conceptual basis for our discussion about the conceptual issues concerning the relation between biology and computation. I recall then that we have two distinctions, the distinction between computational models and computational explanations, and the distinction between a mathematical focus or engineering focus to computation in science that can be applied to the case of biology in order to depict four broad categories in which we can identify different, a plethora of different theoretical projects in contemporary biology. The conceptual challenges that I attempted to identify are not related, some of them are related to one category more specifically, but they are intended to found interesting topic of discussions in the relation between these different theoretical projects. These open challenges are multiple realizability, the distinction between abstract concrete, the distinction between hardware and software, ontology and realism. Yeah, these are just labels. Now I will spell out the details, and I hope you will find interesting this way of conceptualize these all these open problems. So let's start with multiple realizability. Multiple realizability usually discussed in the context of philosophy of mind cognition. There are a few interesting exceptions, like for instance Shapiro and Sober 2007, Fang 2018, or the recent paper by Koskinen. There are many definitions of multiple realizability, but I tried to define it in a very general way in order to provide a useful definition in order to understand where the problem is in this specific case. We can say that a property or a process is multiply realizable if and only if it is the same according to a given theoretical framework in two different systems, S1 and S2, but it is differently instantiated physically or causally or structurally in the two systems, S1 and S2. And obviously, this notion of multiple realizability is crucial for both mathematical and engineering explanations. This is because if biological properties are not multiply realizable, then they are not virtually realizable, like the supporter of mathematical explanations believe, or they are realizable only on organic supports, wetware, against what the supporter of engineering explanations argue. Well, there is a very technical discussion about multiple realization that recently gained a Bookland treatment. That is this book by Polgar and Shapiro, the multiple realization book. As I said before, most of effort to understand multiple realizability has been developed within the philosophy of cognitive science or the philosophy of mind. But in this book, the authors provide an interesting criticism to multiple realizability that is interesting also in this context. The idea is that abstract descriptions, that is mathematical, algorithmic descriptions, are insufficient to identify alternative instantiations of putative, multiply realizable phenomena. So they claim that abstract descriptions are intrinsically, I draw this term from Van Frassen, 2012, omittal. That is to say that abstract description, in order to represent a phenomenon, in order to focus on certain relevant aspects of phenomena, must neglect other aspects of the phenomenon. So in this sense, they are never identical to the phenomenon itself. They can just be representations of that phenomenon. But of course, if Polgar and Shapiro are right, and I'm not sure that is the case, then no purely mathematical explanation of biological system can succeed. Yeah, because mathematical explanations of biological systems are necessarily omittal of some of the details of the biological system itself. And in this case, if this is the case, mathematical explanation always will need to be complemented by engineering explanations. So in order to have a computational explanation of biological system or phenomenon, we should also spell out the engineering details of the phenomenon. So again, if this is the case, soft A-life programs will collapse on hard A-life programs. This is indeed compatible with what suggested by Piccinini 2015 about the search for alternative supports for computation. At that point of his book, he provides a list of requirements for a certain phenomenon be considered as properly realizing computations. And so I took this list and I slightly adapted to the present case because I think that it is very interesting and it said a lot about what kind of questions should be answered by the supporter of computational explanations in biology. So in order to say that a biological system is realizing computations, we should answer the following questions. First, what are the digits, the bits, which when manipulated in biological computation, allow to say that the organism or the biological system is indeed a computer? And what are the types of such digits? Second, what are the elementary computational operations on biological digits and what are the components that perform them? Third, how are the digits concatenated to one another so that strings of them can be identified as inputs, internal states, and outputs of biological mechanisms, and not trivial computations from input strings to output strings can be ascribed to biological mechanisms? Fourth, what are the compositional rules between elementary operations and the corresponding ways to connect the components such that complex operations can be formed out of elementary ones and performed by the mechanism? Fifth, if biological systems store programs or even just data for computations, what are the memory shells and registers and how do they work? And sixth, what are the control units that determine which operations are executed at given time and how do they work? So the question is, if we want to say that this kind of project or this kind of project indeed are able to say us that, to tell us that the biological system being modeled are instances of computers, we should be able to give an answer of all these questions concerning these specific biological systems. Okay? This is the first open problem that I would like to point out. Second question, the interfaces between abstract and concrete. Well, I said that according to Polgar and Shapiro, abstract description are insufficient to identify alternative instantiation of putative multiple realizable phenomena because abstract description are intrinsically omittal. They only work as a representation of phenomena. They are unable to identify properly a phenomenon as instance of another kind of phenomenon. But this will not seem the case in the case of computer or computational devices, because abstract descriptions are not just representations or computational devices, but are a vital component of any work in computational systems. Take, for instance, an assembler. That is an important component for a computer, for an artifactual computer, and allows it to work properly. An assembler, it is responsible for translate an abstractly encoded human unstable string in an abstract binary code, which is decoded by the CPU and generate a subsequent concrete behavior. Without an abstract component, this is the idea, that is the manipulation of an abstract and arbitrary code, a computer could not work the way it works, that is the way in which we want it to work. So, for instance, according to Horstman and others, in order to work properly, a computer needs both a concrete support and an abstract interpreter. I use this term that is not exactly the same term, the same phrase that Horstman and others use. That is an element or an entity that is responsible for the encoding and decoding of information in the concrete support. In artificial computers, this entity is external. It is the human being. Human beings build computers according to a certain previous design, program the hardware, invent different coding languages to make the computer accomplish specific tasks, etc. So it is interesting to wonder if this same understanding can be applied. According to Horstman and others, yes, it makes sense to wonder if there exist natural computers. And this is because in natural computer, like for instance, bacterial chemotaxis or biosynthesis, we have an interpreter that is somehow internal. And what does it mean for a biological system to be an interpreted? Well, it will be a certain device or mechanism that is responsible to discretize the environmental analogical stimuli or signaling with other entities or internally, like for instance in biochemical transduction. Okay, so the question here is, if we don't accept the conclusion drawn by Polgar and Shapiro that necessarily abstraction is just representation, and we accept the idea that abstraction is an essential component in any kind of computation, if we want to identify something like a natural computer, we should be able to identify those devices, this abstract interpreter that in a biological system are able to translate different codes, that are able to translate analogical stimuli, like for instance, environmental stimuli, in elements of the system and elements that the system can compute. Okay. So passing on to the third conceptual challenge, the interaction between hardware and software, it usually thought that the distinction between hardware and software is identical to the distinction between concrete and abstract. And in some way it makes sense, but both hardware and software have, strictly speaking, concrete and abstract elements. A software is not just code, but it must have a concrete counterpart in order to be able to produce specific computations. That is, specific patterns of activation of bits, concrete computations. And on the other hand, an hardware is not just a concrete support for a computation. It must be arranged, organized, so as to provide a proper support to receive and manipulate abstract encoded informations. So this is nothing absolutely new, but I think that is more interesting and rewarding to think about software as the element that can concern that the instructions that a computer can execute, and the term hardware as the term denoting the element responsible for the execution of such instructions. This is a kind of normative conception of the distinction between software and hardware. The software determines what is the correct behavior of the hardware according to certain specific goals. And it is interesting in the case of computers, personal computers or artifactual computers, that a computer behaving in disagreement with software instructions is not performing an alternative computation, but it is miscomputing. That is, it is not performing a computation at all. Now, the question is this distinction between hardware and software intended as a distinction between execution and extraction relevant in our modeling or explanation of biological systems? Can environmental or internal biochemical metabolic stimuli be properly conceptualized as instruction? It makes sense. Does it make sense? Is a biological system behaving at odds with environmental or internal instruction necessarily miscomputing? I think that this question can be summarized in this last question. Could a biological software, that is a set of biological instructions, be considered as a software allowing a greater degree of freedom to the hardware? And what would be the difference between an artifactual or more rigid software and a natural software? So talking about ontology, in some sense, all these discussions deals with an ontological discussion. Of course, to talk about of multiple realizability involve a discussion about our ontology of computation, of concrete computation, and of biological systems, of course. And the same can be said about the distinction between abstractness and concreteness, which is a kind of reproposition of the distinction between body and mind, and the distinction between hardware and software. And when I talk here of ontology, I would call the attention on a specific issue concerning our understanding of biological phenomena through mathematical modeling. In computational modeling, the biological object is, so to speak, transferred, translated to an artificial support. For instance, this is the instance here, is the example here in the picture in DNA sequencing. And when the biological object is transferred to the artificial support, what is analyzed and manipulated is not the biological phenomena itself, but the artificial counterpart. So computational modeling is very different from traditional biological practices, which were chiefly experimental. Of course, modeling computational modeling involve all those kind of problems which are usually discussed when we consider the relation between models and reality, not just computational models, but all the models. But there are also specific questions related to computational modeling in biology. Databases convey data at the molecular scale, and they usually do not adequately represent the physiology they describe. This is something that is accepted by the practitioners. And so when we attempt to understand the biological system through the databases, the reconstruction and interpretation of data is theory-laden. And most importantly, the theoretical concerns, the theory which allow the reconstruction and the interpretation of such data is itself computational. That is the search for efficient data, structure, and algorithms. And more rarely, it is directed to the integration of this data with the pre-existing non-computational driven biological knowledge. So the question is, of course, which guarantee do we have that this computational driven knowledge is accurate to depict real world biological phenomena? To conclude, I would like to spend some words about a last problem, realism, which of course also related to ontology, but indirectly to all the previous concerns. And it could be formulated in this way. Most of the previous debate has been framed within a realist perspective. I wondered if biological properties can be considered as computational, if biological system can be considered as computers, but this approach itself may be challenged. What if there are no biological or computational natural kinds? That is, if there are no computational or biological properties that can be identified independently from the observer. So we should reframe our categories or the relation between our categories in a different way. And of course, the first consequence of this ontological reconsideration would seem to be that computational explanations that seem to suppose that we can recreate something distinctive biological in computers or vice versa would be doomed to collapse into computational modeling. If we cannot hold a realist attitude towards the relation between computation and biology, then it does not make sense to ask if an organism is a computer or if a computer is an organism, because the relation between the two realms of entities will be just of representation. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.